So if a man, bites off another man's nose in a bar fight, is he guilty of stabbing him?
You'd think so, right.
Right. I mean, your common sense probably screams, yes, he is guilty of a horrific crime. But in 19th century England, a judge looked at the law, looked at the victim's missing nose, and just let the biter walk completely free.
Completely free.
Yeah. And why?
Mm-hmm.
Literally just because of grammar. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring the hidden and honestly often bizarre machinery of the justice system. We're looking at the art of statutory interpretation. Basically, the way judges decode the laws that, govern our everyday lives.
It's a fascinating landscape because a single comma can literally decide whether you go to prison or whether a widow gets compensation or whether a corporation gets away with millions.
Which is terrifying, honestly.
It really is. And in my years as a law professor at Osmania University, this is usually the exact point where students realize the law is not a math equation. It is this living, breathing, and highly volatile exercise in translation.
Yeah, and we've got a really fascinating stack of case studies to get through today. The core premise we are trying to understand for you, the listener, is how the exact same sentence written in black and white can mean completely different things depending on which interpretative toolkit a judge decides to open.
Exactly.
But before we get to the tools, we have to understand the materials we are working with, right? Because you mentioned to me earlier that there's a sequential process here, interpretation and then construction.
Right. So that is the foundational mechanism of the entire legal system. People tend to use those two words interchangeably in everyday conversation, but legally, they are two very distinct phases of a judge's job.
Okay, so break that down for us.
Well, interpretation is phase one. It is strictly about deciphering the text. So you are looking at the vocabulary, the syntax, the grammatical structure chosen by the legislature. What is the literal dictionary meaning of these words on the page?
So it's just defining the terms.
Defining the terms in a vacuum, essentially. But then you have construction, which is phase two. That is the application of that interpreted meaning to a specific, messy, real-world factual dispute.
Right.
So interpretation finds the meaning, but construction gives it practical legal effect to determine the actual rights and liabilities of the human being standing in the courtroom.
It sounds a bit like cooking to me. Like, interpretation is like reading a recipe card. You are just looking at the words on the card, 2 cups of flour, bake at 350 degrees.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
You're figuring out what the text demands.
Yeah.
But construction is actually baking the cake. It's figuring out if that recipe works with the humidity in your kitchen, the quirks of your specific oven, and, whether your guests are actually going to eat it.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. You cannot bake the cake without reading the recipe first, but reading the text alone doesn't actually solve the human problem in front of you. Construction is where the law actually touches society. And the first, most rigid method judges use to read that recipe is the grammatical rule, or more commonly known as the literal rule.
The literal rule, okay, this sounds like the baseline. Just do what the paper says.
It is the absolute baseline. The literal rule dictates that the court must look exclusively at the verbal expression of the law. The Latin term is litera legis, the letter of the law. Yeah. And the foundational philosophy here is that the legislature, the elected parliament, perfectly encapsulated their intention in the specific words they chose to use. If the language is plain and unambiguous, it must be applied strictly.
Wait, even if the outcome is completely unjust or just totally weird?
Especially then. The courts are not permitted to go beyond what is expressed. They cannot modify the text, and they definitely cannot add words just because the literal application causes hardship. There's this famous doctrine that the natural meaning of words cannot be departed from simply because the judge finds the result distasteful.
Wow. Which brings us back to the guy who bit off a nose and got away with it. This is the case of R.V. Harris. Let's unpack this.
Yes, an infamous case from 1836.
So walk us through the mechanics of this. Harris gets into a vicious fight. He bites off the victim's nose. He is arrested and charged under a specific statute that outlaws stabbing, cutting, or wounding. So he goes to court. What actually happens?
Well, the defense attorney points to the literal rule. The court is forced to interpret the words stabbing, cutting, or wounding. Now, you have to look at the grammatical conventions of the time. The court determined that in the English language, the phrase stabbing, cutting, or wounding inherently implied the use of an external instrument.
Like a knife.
A knife, a sword, a broken bottle, something you bring to the fight.
But teeth cause wounds. I mean, anyone who has been bitten knows it's a wound.
Biologically, yes, absolutely. But grammatically, within the context of that specific 19th century criminal statute, the court held that teeth are an inherent part of the human anatomy. They are not an instrument brought to a fight.
That is wild.
So under the strict literal rule, the physical act of biting, even resulting in the amputation of a nose, did not legally constitute stabbing, cutting, or wounding.
So the judge just says, well, grammar dictates he didn't use a tool, so he's innocent.
Yeah.
How does the legal system justify that kind of semantic pedantry? It feels like the judge is just abdicating their responsibility to, do justice.
It definitely feels that way to the public, certainly.
Yeah.
But from the perspective of constitutional theory, the judge is actually showing extreme restraint.
Restraint? How?
Because the literalist judge believes their job is strictly to apply the law, not to write it. The philosophy is basically, if Parliament wanted to criminalize biting, they had every opportunity to write the word biting into the statute.
I see.
By refusing to stretch the definition, the judge is respecting the separation of powers. They are forcing the legislature to do its job properly and fix the law.
It's like dealing with a stubbornly literal genie. You rub the lamp, you ask for $1 million, and instead of money, the genie crushes you under a stampede of 1 million male deer.
Right.
Because you said bucks. The genie doesn't care about your intent. He only cares about the exact vocabulary you used.
The literal rule is exactly that genie. And while the nose-biting case sounds like a bizarre piece of trivia, the consequences of this rule can be profoundly tragic. Consider the case of London and Northeastern Railway Co. v. Berriman.
Oh man, this one is rough. This is the one from 1946. A railway worker named Berriman is out on the tracks.
Yes, he is doing routine maintenance. Specifically, he is oiling the apparatus that connects the railway tracks to keep the switches moving smoothly. And tragically, a train comes through. He doesn't hear it in time, and he is killed.
And his widow sues the railway company for compensation, which makes total sense to anyone. I mean, he died performing his duties on the job. And there was a law for this, right? The Fatal Accidents Act.
There was a law, yes. The statute specifically provided financial compensation for railway workers who were killed while relaying or repairing tracks.
Relaying or repairing. Okay, I see the grammatical trap here.
The railway company's lawyers seized on those two exact words. They argued before the House of Lords that the court must apply the literal rule. Relaying means pulling up old track and putting down entirely new track. Repairing means fixing a track that is broken or malfunctioning.
And Berriman was just oiling the track. It wasn't broken. He was doing preventative maintenance.
Precisely the legal distinction. Oiling is maintenance. It is not repairing, and it is not relaying.
Oh, no.
Because oiling did not literally fit the statutory verbs, the House of Lords ruled that the widow was not entitled to a single penny of compensation. The statute simply did not cover his specific physical activity.
That is just brutal. The man is dead. He was maintaining the tracks for public safety, but because Parliament used the word repairing instead of maintaining, his family is left completely destitute.
It exposes the ultimate weakness of the literal rule. It assumes an unobtainable perfection in legal draftsmanship. Lawmakers are human, right? They cannot foresee every single physical scenario that might arise decades in the future. The literal rule demands a linguistic perfection that simply does not exist.
Clearly, people realize this and actively exploit it, because if you know the genie is literal, you can game the system. Like the flick knife case in the 1950s.
Fisher v. Bell. This is the textbook example of a loophole being successfully exploited through the intersection of different areas of law.
So the UK passes the Restriction of Offensive Weapons Act in 1959. They're trying to crack down on street gangs, and the law explicitly bans the offer for sale of flick knives. And then a shopkeeper, James Bell, puts a flick knife right in his shop window. He even puts a price tag on it. It feels like a blatant, undeniable violation of the law.
To a layperson walking down the street, yes, absolutely. But James Bell's lawyers understood the literal rule, and they understood English contract law. In contract law, placing an item in a shop window with a price tag is not legally defined as an offer for sale.
Wait, how is a price tag in a window not an offer to sell something? That makes no sense.
It's because of the mechanics of how a contract is formed. Legally, the window display is called an invitation to treat. It means the shopkeeper is inviting the customer to walk into the store, pick up the item, take it to the cash register, and make the shopkeeper an offer to buy it.
Right.
The shopkeeper then accepts that offer, forming the contract.
That is maddeningly technical.
It is, but it is the bedrock of contract law. So, grammatically and legally, Bell had not made an offer for sale. He had made an invitation to treat. The divisional court, applying the literal rule, gave the words their strict technical legal meaning and found him not guilty.
He effectively thumbed his nose at Parliament. He continued distributing dangerous weapons because the drafters of the criminal statute didn't realize they were triggering a highly technical contract law definition.
Exactly.
So how does the system survive this? I mean, if judges are forced to be this literal, wouldn't the entire legal system just collapse into a series of semantic loopholes? There has to be a correction mechanism, right?
You are touching on a debate that has raged in jurisprudence for centuries. The courts eventually realized that unyielding literalism can make a mockery of the law. So they developed a safety valve. When the literal rule leads to a result that is manifestly absurd, unreasonable, or completely contrary to the obvious intention of the legislature, the courts can pivot to what is called the golden rule.
The golden rule.
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
How does that change the judge's toolkit?
Well, what's fascinating here is how the golden rule acts as a safety valve for the English language. It recognizes that language has limitations and draftsmanship is rarely perfect. Words have multiple meanings, grammar can be clunky, typos happen. The rule allows judges to depart from the strict literal meaning just enough to avoid the absurdity while still fundamentally respecting the legislature's overall goal.
So they get to tweak the recipe if they realize the original text is going to result in a cake made of salt instead of sugar.
A fitting way to look at it. Let's examine the case of Adler v. George from 1964. This is really a masterclass in the golden rule.
The pedantic spy case. Okay, I love this one. So a defendant is charged under the Official Secrets Act. The specific crime is obstructing a member of the armed forces in the vicinity of a prohibited place, like a highly sensitive Royal Air Force station. But the defendant wasn't hanging around outside the perimeter fence. He had actually broken into the base. He was physically inside the prohibited area.
And his defense strategy relies entirely on the literal rule.
Right. The defense says, look at the dictionary. Vicinity means near or surrounding or around. My client wasn't near the base. He was inside the base. Therefore, he didn't violate the statute as written. I wasn't in the vicinity. I was inside.
It is a logically sound literalist argument, but pause and consider the real-world outcome of that interpretation. It would mean that it is a serious crime to obstruct a guard while you are standing on the public sidewalk outside the base. But the moment you successfully scale the fence, evade security, and get inside the top-secret facility, you are suddenly immune from prosecution under that section of the act.
Which is completely insane. You would be rewarding the criminal for successfully breaching national security.
Exactly, the kind of manifest absurdity the golden rule is designed to prevent. The court looked at this and said, we know what Parliament intended. They intended to protect the security of this military installation. So the court read the words in the vicinity of as meaning in or in the vicinity of. They modified the grammar, effectively adding a word, to ensure the legislative intent wasn't defeated by a prepositional loophole. The defendant was convicted.
They patched the glitch in the matrix in real time.
They did. Another fascinating application involves context. The literal rule often treats words in isolation, but the golden rule demands you look at the surrounding environment. Take the case of Powell v. Kempton Park Racecourse Coda Ltd. from 1899.
The floating betting shop. So the statute prohibited betting in any house, office, room, or other place.
Now, apply the literal genie to the phrase other place. Literally any place encompasses every single coordinate in the known universe.
Sure.
But the defendant was operating a betting ring in an open-air enclosure at a race course, specifically the Tattersall's enclosure.
So he says it's not a house, it's not a room, it's an open field.
And the prosecution says, but the law says any place. An open field is a place. The court had to resolve this. Under the golden rule, they applied a sub-principle called ejusdem generis, which means looking at the specific words that came before the general word. The list was house, office, room. What do those have in common? They are enclosed, indoor, specific physical structures.
So the law was clearly targeting underground indoor betting parlors, not the racetrack itself.
Exactly. The court ruled that other place had to be interpreted in the context of the indoor places listed before it. Applying any place to an open-air racecourse would be an absurd overreach of what the lawmakers were actually trying to ban. They read the words reasonably, not just literally.
Okay, so the golden rule handles the accidental absurdities. You know, the typos, the clumsy phrasing. But what happens when the language isn't just clumsy? What happens when citizens are actively, maliciously analyzing the law to find the exact edge of the boundary and then setting up camp right there to continue their bad behavior?
Yeah.
They aren't slipping through a typo. They are exploiting the architecture of the law itself.
When you are dealing with active evasion, we pull out the heaviest conceptual tool in jurisprudence, the mischief rule. It is also known as Hayden's rule, and it requires a complete shift in how a judge approaches the text. We essentially have to time travel.
Time travel? Wait, how does a judge time travel?
By transporting themselves back to the historical moment the legislation was drafted. The mischief rule, which dates back to the 16th century, requires the judge to ask 4 very specific historical questions.
Okay.
First, what was the common law before the new act was passed? Second, what was the mischief or the defect that the old law failed to fix? Third, what specific remedy did Parliament create to cure that disease? And fourth, what is the true reason for that remedy?
So instead of just reading the recipe, you were asking, why did the chef write this recipe in the first place? Were they trying to cure a vitamin deficiency? Were they trying to use up leftover flour? You were trying to find the underlying problem.
You are diagnosing the disease the law was meant to cure. The origin of this rule is deeply embedded in English history. It comes from Hayden's case in 1584.
1584. Wow, so we are deep in the Tudor era. What was the crisis?
King Henry VIII is on the throne. He is in the process of dissolving the monasteries and seizing immense amounts of wealth and property from religious institutions for the crown. The religious institutions know the king's agents are coming, so they start employing a highly complex legal fiction called the doubling of estates.
The doubling of estates. What is that? How does that actually work mechanically?
It is essentially an early form of a shell game. The monasteries would grant long-term leases or create concurrent overlapping estates on their lands to trusted third parties or dummy entities. By doing this, they fractured the legal ownership.
Tricky?
Very. When the king's agents arrived to seize the land, the monastery could say, we don't actually own the rights to this land anymore. It's tied up in this 99-year lease to someone else. It was a deliberate artificial mechanism to hide the property from the crown.
Even in the 1500s, people were setting up offshore trusts to dodge the taxman.
The tactics rarely change, only the paperwork. So, Parliament passes a new law, the Statute of 31 Henry VIII, specifically designed to pierce these fake leases and allow the crown to seize the property anyway. But the religious institutions take it to court, arguing that based on a literal reading of property law, the statute didn't specifically invalidate their exact type of lease.
And this is where the court invents the mischief rule.
Yes. The barons of the Exchequer ruled that a judge's duty is not just to parse the grammar, but to make a construction of the law that suppresses the mischief and advances the remedy. They looked at the historical reality. The old law allowed property to be hidden. The mischief was the hiding of property. The new law was the remedy to stop it.
Right.
Therefore, the court ignored the literalist property law defenses and upheld the crown's seizure. They focused entirely on killing the disease.
That is fascinating historically, but you brought an example from the source materials that is a bit more modern. The case of the balcony prostitutes.
Smith v. Hughes from 1960. It is perhaps the most vivid modern illustration of the mischief rule taught in nearly every law school.
Here's where it gets really interesting. So the context here, 1950s London. The streets are apparently overrun with sex work, and there is a huge public outcry. So the UK passes the Street Offences Act of 1959. The stated goal is to clean up the streets, and the specific wording of the law makes it a crime for a common prostitute to loiter or solicit in a street or public place.
Pay close attention to that phrasing, in a street. That is the geographic boundary set by the literal text.
Right. So the sex workers read the law and they adapt. They realize that if they step off the pavement, they aren't technically in the street. So they move into the houses. They stand on balconies overlooking the street, or they sit on the ground floor inside private residences, leaving the window half open, and they tap on the glass or call out to the men walking by on the pavement below.
The police arrest them anyway. And in court, the defense attorneys deploy the literal rule.
Your Honor, look at the geographic reality. My client was standing on a balcony on the second floor of a private building. She was not physically in a street. The law does not ban soliciting from a private residence. She is innocent.
If the judge, Lord Chief Justice Parker, had applied the literal rule, or even the golden rule, he would have been forced to acquit them. Just like the flick knife shopkeeper, they had found a physical loophole outside the literal text. But Lord Parker invoked the mischief rule.
He goes back to the 4 questions.
Yes. He asked, what was the mischief that this act was aimed at? He concluded that everybody knew the act was intended to clean up the public thoroughfares, to enable everyday citizens to walk along the pavement without being molested or constantly solicited. That was the disease.
So the geographic location of the woman's feet didn't matter.
It was entirely irrelevant. The court ruled that it did not matter if the prostitute was standing directly on the cobblestones or elevated on a balcony or sitting behind a window frame. Their action, the vocal soliciting, projected out into the street and caused the exact mischief the law was designed to eradicate. The women were convicted because the court prioritized suppressing the mischief over the literal geography.
It's like catching someone polluting a river. It doesn't matter if you pour the toxic sludge directly into the water from a boat, or if you stand 10 feet away on private land and use a hose to spray it into the river still gets polluted. The mischief is the pollution, not where you were standing.
A very apt modern parallel, and that line of thinking evolved. The mischief rule is the direct ancestor of what modern courts use constantly today, the purposive approach.
The purposive approach, looking for the overriding purpose.
Yes, courts today frequently look beyond the strict letter to find the broader socioeconomic spirit of the law. We see this in corporate law all the time. The syllabus highlights Jones v. Tower Boot Co. Ltd. from 1997.
This was a labor dispute, right? About redundancy and mass layoffs.
Correct. The law stated that if a company was doing mass layoffs, they had to conduct collective redundancy consultations if the layoffs were happening at one establishment. Now, this particular shoe company operated several different factories and buildings that were all interconnected in the same local area.
Okay.
When they initiated layoffs, they tried to avoid the legal requirement to consult the union by arguing that because there were multiple separate physical buildings, they were not one establishment.
So they're using architectural blueprints as a loophole. Look, there's an alleyway between building A and building B, so we don't have to follow the labor law.
That was the literalist argument, but the House of Lords rejected it using the purposive approach. They asked, what is the purpose of this labor law? The purpose is to protect employees' rights and ensure fair negotiation during mass layoffs. Given that purpose, they interpreted at one establishment broadly to include all the interconnected premises in that locality. They stretched the text to protect the workers, rather than letting the corporation use physical doorways as an escape hatch.
Okay, I follow the logic. But I have to say, this makes me deeply uncomfortable. We've gone from the strict, unyielding literal rule, which is unfair but at least predictable, to the purposive approach, where a judge could just say, well, the spirit of the law means I can punish you, even if the text doesn't explicitly say so. Doesn't that give the state way too much power? If a judge can just stretch the law to catch you, how can anyone know what is actually legal?
You are hitting on the exact pivot point of modern legal philosophy. That discomfort you feel is the tension between the rule of law and the desire for justice, and the legal system recognizes that danger. This is why the rules of interpretation undergo a massive fundamental shift when the stakes change. When we move from civil disputes or corporate regulations into the realm of penal statutes, the entire toolkit flips.
Penal statutes, meaning criminal law. Laws where the government can fine you or take away your liberty and put you in a cage.
Exactly. When the power of the state is mobilized to deprive a citizen of their freedom or property, the judge drops the purposive approach and picks up the rule of strict construction.
Strict construction. This sounds like we are going back to the literal genie.
It is similar, but heavily weighted in favor of the defendant. The doctrine of strict construction dictates that a person cannot be penalized without a clear, unambiguous, and unequivocal letter of the law. If there is any ambiguity in a penal statute, if a sentence could reasonably be interpreted in two different ways, the judge is legally obligated to choose the interpretation that favors the accused.
So the tie goes to the runner every single time.
Every single time. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is about the fundamental human right to liberty. You cannot lock a human being in a cell based on a judge's assumption of what Parliament might have meant. You cannot imprison someone on the spirit of the law. If the state wants to strip you of your freedom, the burden is on the state to write a perfectly clear law. If they fail, the citizen walks free.
The notes from Osmania University highlight a landmark Indian case on this, Tolaram v. State of Bombay.
Yes, Tolaram is the definitive bedrock of this principle in Indian jurisprudence. It involved complex regulations around rent control and whether a landlord had illegally accepted a premium. But the specific facts are honestly less important than the monumental ruling delivered by Chief Justice Mahajan.
What did he decree?
He stated explicitly, if two possible and reasonable constructions can be put upon a penal provision, the court must lean towards that construction which exempts the subject from penalty rather than the one which imposes a penalty.
So even if the judge personally believes the defendant is probably guilty, if the law is badly written, the judge's hands are tied. They must acquit.
Yes, it acts as an impenetrable shield for the citizen against the immense, crushing power of the state apparatus. The court is explicitly forbidden from stretching the meaning of an expression just to carry out the perceived intention of the legislature. In criminal law, assumptions, purpose of stretching, and spirit of the law arguments have absolutely no place. The text must be precise.
But the syllabus sets up a fascinating dichotomy here. It contrasts this shield of strict construction with something called the sword of beneficial construction. If penal laws are rigid, does that mean beneficial laws are elastic?
You've anticipated the exact counter mechanism. The stakes dictate the tool. Penal statutes punish, so they are strict. Beneficial statutes, often called welfare legislation or socioeconomic laws, are designed to help people. They exist to protect consumers, aid the destitute, or support vulnerable workers against powerful corporations.
So when the laws try to help someone who is vulnerable, the judges are allowed to stretch it again.
Precisely. When a law is demonstrably beneficial, courts adopt a liberal or beneficial construction. They actively stretch and interpret the language as broadly as possible to ensure the maximum benefit reaches the class of persons the law was intended to protect.
Let's look at the power company case. TN Electricity Board v. Samathi.
A classic David and Goliath scenario. There were state regulations requiring the electricity board to pay compensation to consumers if there were severe, prolonged service interruptions or accidents resulting from negligence. The power company, utilizing a vast team of lawyers, tried to use a narrow, literal, strict reading of the procedural rules to disqualify consumers and avoid paying out the compensation.
Trying to use the literal rule as a corporate shield.
Exactly. But the Supreme Court of India intervened. They recognized this was welfare legislation. They held that the entire underlying purpose of the regulation was to protect the interests of everyday consumers. Therefore, they rejected the strict literal reading. They favored the consumer, applying a beneficial construction to ensure the compensation scheme actually functioned in reality, not just on paper.
There's an English housing case that does the exact same thing, right? Asquith v. London Borough of Lewisham.
Yes, dealing with the Housing Act. The act was specifically drafted to help provide emergency accommodation for the homeless. A local authority tried to rely on a narrow, pedantic reading of the text that might have allowed them to avoid providing housing in a complex edge case. But the House of Lords defied the literal reading.
They stretched it again.
They applied beneficial construction to fulfill the undeniable social purpose of the act, which was getting homeless people off the streets. They stretched the legal definition of the authority's duty to provide the maximum social benefit.
So you have a system that is incredibly schizophrenic but beautifully balanced. We have judges acting like literal pedants for nosebiters. Then they are time-traveling psychologists hunting for mischief with balcony prostitutes. When the government wants to put you in jail, the judge becomes a strict grammarian to protect your liberty. But when a homeless person needs shelter, the judge stretches the words like rubber to make sure they get it.
It is a delicate, constantly shifting equilibrium.
But that brings up a massive logistical problem. What happens when the judge is looking at a single document, a single piece of legislation, and paragraph A says one thing, but paragraph B seems to say the exact opposite? If they're trying to balance all these rules, how do they handle a law that is literally fighting with itself?
That takes us into the final tier of our deep dive, the judge's toolbox. Specifically, how a judge handles internal contradictions using the doctrine of harmonious construction.
Harmonious construction.
Yeah.
Hearing you describe that, it sounds like a conductor dealing with a badly tuned orchestra.
That is a brilliant analogy. Expand on that. How do you see it?
Well, imagine you have a massive symphony orchestra.
Yeah.
The string section is aggressively playing a fast, upbeat waltz, but the brass section, reading from a different page of the sheet music, is playing a slow, mournful funeral march. It sounds terrible. It's a total clash. Now, a bad conductor might just point to the brass section and say, shut up, stop playing entirely. But a master conductor, the judge, has to adjust the tempo, tweak the dynamics, and interpret the sheet music so that both sections can harmonize and play together to create one coherent piece of music.
That perfectly encapsulates the Latin maxim ex viceribus actus, which means a statute must be read as a whole, from its very bowels. You cannot take one section of a law and use it to bludgeon another section to death.
Because if the judge just tells the brass section to stop playing, they have effectively deleted a part of the law that Parliament wrote.
And legally, that is called reducing a provision to a dead letter. A dead letter is a law that is still in the books but has been interpreted into uselessness. The Supreme Court of India has repeatedly warned against this. They have established that when there are two provisions in an enactment that seem to directly contradict each other, the judge cannot simply pick a favorite. They must be interpreted so that, if at all possible, effect is given to both. Harmonization is not equivalent to destruction. The judge must tune the instruments so they both contribute to the melody.
But let's get practical here. The judge is sitting at their desk, staring at a confusing, contradictory statute. What physical parts of the document are they actually looking at to find the tuning notes? Where are the clues?
They begin by looking at what we call internal aids. These are structural clues built directly into the text of the statute itself by the drafters.
Give me an example of an internal aid.
The most prominent is the preamble. This is the introductory paragraph at the very beginning of the Act. It doesn't usually contain enforceable rules, but it explains the overarching goal, the historical context, and the philosophy of the legislation. If Section 4 and Section 9 are contradicting each other, the judge will read the preamble to see which section aligns better with the stated overall goal.
It's like reading the blurb on the back of a novel to understand what genre of book you are about to read.
Exactly. Then you have the interpretation clauses. Many large, complex statutes have their own built-in dictionary in Section 2. For instance, the Indian Penal Code doesn't rely on a regular dictionary to define crimes. It has specific, exhaustive clauses defining exactly what legally constitutes theft, or the precise difference between murder and culpable homicide, not amounting to murder. The judge doesn't guess. They look at the internal dictionary.
I also saw marginal notes listed in the university materials. What are those?
Literally, they are brief notes printed in the margins next to complex sections. They act as a quick index or summary of what the section is about. Historically, they weren't considered strong aids because clerks, not Parliament, sometimes added them. But modern courts sometimes glance at them to quickly grasp the general drift of a dense paragraph.
Okay, so the judge uses the preamble, the internal dictionary, the margin notes. But what if the document is just hopelessly broken? The internal aids are exhausted, the orchestra is still out of tune, and the judge is stuck. What then?
When the four corners of the document fail to provide an answer, judges must look outside the text. They turn to external aids.
So they leave the courtroom and go to the library.
Quite literally. They will look at the historical context of the era, they will study previous laws that were repealed to understand the evolution of the policy, and perhaps most importantly, they will look at legislative debates.
Wait, they read the transcripts of politicians arguing with each other on the floor of Parliament?
Yes, though with caution. A monumental example of this is the case of State of UT Demon Upataya.
Walk us through the mechanics of that.
The Supreme Court of India was grappling with an incredibly dense constitutional issue regarding the scope of fundamental rights under Article 14, the right to equality before the law. The text alone wasn't providing a clear answer to the specific nuance they were facing. So to figure out what the text truly meant, the justices went back to the primary source. They literally pulled the historical transcripts from the Constituent Assembly debates.
They read the diaries of the Founding Fathers.
Essentially, yes. They read the speeches, the arguments, and the compromises made by the framers of the Constitution. By understanding the fears and the aspirations the framers voiced on the assembly floor, the court could discern the underlying principles they were attempting to codify into the fundamental rights. It is a powerful tool to resolve deep constitutional ambiguity.
That is profound. It really shows how law is just codified history. But that raises a huge existential question to end on. So what does this all mean? If we rely on all these complex tools, literal rules, golden rules, external debates to build and maintain the structure of the law, what happens when lawmakers simply hit the delete button?
The effect of repeal. This is the final, crucial complication in understanding statutory interpretation.
Right. If a law is repealed, is it just gone? Erased from the hard drive as if it never existed?
Under the General Clauses Act of 1897, the overarching general rule is yes. If a law is repealed, it is obliterated from the statute books. It is legally dead, and courts treat it as if it never existed. However, society cannot function if the past is constantly being erased. So, there is a massive structural exception to protect stability.
How does the exception work?
A repeal does not operate retroactively to destroy the past. It does not affect actions that were already legally completed under that law before it was deleted. It does not erase property rights or privileges that citizens had already acquired. And crucially, for our discussion of penal statutes, it does not cancel penalties, punishments, or ongoing investigations for crimes committed while the law was still active.
Let me make sure I understand the mechanics of this. If I commit a crime on a Tuesday and Parliament realizes the law is terrible and completely repeals it on Wednesday, I can still be prosecuted, convicted, and sent to jail on Thursday for what I did on Tuesday.
Yes. The repeal is not a get-out-of-jail-free card for past actions. The legal machinery continues to process the events that occurred while the law was alive. The ghost of the repealed statute survives specifically to conclude the business that started under its watch.
Wow. This has been a massive journey. We started this hour thinking the law was an engineering manual. Move 3 spaces, binary outcomes. But we've seen that reading the law is actually an active, dynamic, and incredibly human process of translation. Judges aren't just calculators parsing grammar. They have to act as historians looking for the mischief. They act as ethicists balancing strict liberty against beneficial welfare. And they act as conductors, harmonizing contradictory sheet music.
And that is the ultimate takeaway I try to impart to every law student. The words any place or stabbing or in a street seem incredibly simple on a chalkboard. But the moment you introduce the messy, unpredictable, and often malicious reality of human behavior, language breaks down. The law is not a self-executing computer code. It fundamentally requires human judgment to connect the abstract text to the reality of human suffering, malice, and need.
Which leads me to a final thought I want to leave you, the listener, with. We are living in an era of rapid, unprecedented technological advancement. We are already seeing AI used for legal research. We are getting closer to a world where machines might draft legal contracts or even act as preliminary judges for minor civil disputes.
A prospect that is both fascinating and terrifying to the legal academy.
Right. But think about the incredibly nuanced tools we just spent an hour discussing. If an AI judge is programmed to be highly efficient and read purely literally, would it let the nosebiter go free? Would it deny the widow her railway compensation over the definition of the word repairing? Or, conversely, if we program the algorithm to be purposive and look for the mischief, would it stretch the law further than an elected parliament ever intended, acting like a rogue algorithm making its own laws? Can lines of code ever truly balance the cold grammatical letter of the law with the human spirit of the law, the way these complex rules demand? Think about that the next time you blindly click "I agree" on a terms and conditions page. You never know what kind of genie you are making a deal with.